They thought they could trap her, with their clever wordplay interrupting before she could finish each point. Her calm response reframed the entire conversation. Suddenly, the audience was nodding along with her. A young spokesperson walked into a liberal news studio. The host had already decided how the interview would end, but nobody expected what happened next. Morgan Hayes had built his career on moments like these, calculated takedowns of conservative guests that would rack up millions of views online, and on this particular evening he thought he had found his perfect target. Caroline Levitt was young, poised, and completely outnumbered as she sat across from a panel of seasoned liberal commentators waiting for the cameras to roll. Hayes adjusted his designer tie, a hint of a smirk playing at the corner of his mouth. He had prepared for this, spent hours crafting questions designed not to inform, but to trap, to corner, to humiliate. The production assistants hustled around the set, making last-minute adjustments to lighting, checking sound levels as the countdown began. 5 minutes to air, Hayes leaned back in his chair, reviewing his notes, occasionally glancing up at his guest, sizing her up like a predator would its prey. Caroline Levitt sat perfectly still, her posture straight but not rigid, hands folded neatly in her lap. To the untrained eye, she might have appeared nervous, perhaps even intimidated by the heavyweight lineup assembled against her, but there was something in her eyes, a quiet confidence that Hayes missed entirely. Too busy was he imagining how this clip would play across social media tomorrow, how his followers would praise his cutting interview style, how this segment might finally push his show past its competitors in the ratings war. 3 minutes to air, one of the panelists, a Pulitzer-winning journalist with graying temples and horn-rimmed glasses, leaned over to Hayes. "Should be an easy one tonight," he whispered. "These young conservatives, they don't have the experience to handle the pressure." Hayes nodded with a chuckle. "This isn't her first rodeo, but it might be her last." They both laughed, a private joke at Caroline's expense, not realizing she had heard every word. Her expression unchanged as she took a small sip of water. The floor director signaled 2 minutes. The energy in the studio shifted, that electric anticipation that comes before a live broadcast. Camera operators took their positions. Producers spoke in hushed tones through headsets. The audience settled in their seats, most of them New York liberals, ready to witness what they assumed would be another public dismantling of conservative talking points. Hayes rolled his shoulders back, preparing his on-air persona, the one that had made him famous, part intellectual, part prosecutor. Always in control, always one step ahead. He had interviewed presidents, questioned CEOs, grilled world leaders with the same relentless approach. And tonight's guest was merely a stepping stone, another clip for his highlight reel. What Hayes didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Caroline Levitt had been underestimated before. Her entire career had been built on proving people wrong, on exceeding expectations, on turning assumptions into advantages. She had studied Hayes, watched his interviews, analyzed his tactics while he had been preparing questions. She had been preparing something entirely different, a strategy. 1 minute to air. The studio lights brightened to their full intensity, casting harsh shadows across the sleek set, highlighting the stark power imbalance. 1 conservative spokesperson, 4 liberal commentators, and a host famous for his ruthless questioning. The odds appeared overwhelmingly stacked against her. The floor director began the countdown. 30 seconds. Hayes straightened his posture, leaning slightly forward. Aggressive positioning for the camera. The panelists adopted their serious expressions, ready to jump in with supporting fire when Hayes gave the signal. 15 seconds. Caroline took one final deep breath, her eyes momentarily closing, then opening with a clarity that would soon become apparent to everyone. 5, 4, 3, 2. The red lights on the cameras illuminated, and Morgan Hayes launched into his opening monologue. "Good evening and welcome to the Hayes Report. Tonight we're discussing the growing divide in American politics and the conservative movement's struggle to connect with younger voters. His tone was measured, authoritative, setting the stage. Joining us is Caroline Levitt, conservative spokesperson and former Trump administration official. The camera cut to Caroline, who nodded slightly, a professional acknowledgement of the introduction, nothing in her expression revealing her thoughts. What happened over the next hour would become one of the most talked about television moments of the year. It began, predictably enough, Hayes setting up. His first question, designed to back Caroline into a corner: Ms. Levitt, polls show your party struggling significantly with voters under 30, yet you continue to push policies that young Americans overwhelmingly reject. How do you justify positions that seem fundamentally out of touch with the future of this country? His delivery was perfect, his expression a mixture of curiosity and skepticism, the kind that suggested he was simply asking what everyone was thinking. But Caroline recognized the trap, the false premise, the loaded framing. She had seen it dozens of times before. She paused just long enough to make Hayes think he had her on the ropes. Then she smiled, not the nervous smile of someone scrambling for an answer, but the confident smile of someone who had been waiting for exactly this question. I appreciate your concern for young voters, Morgan, she began, her voice steady, clear, but I think we should look at the actual data, not just the narratives that get repeated in certain circles. Hayes blinked, a subtle tell, but one she caught immediately. He hadn't expected a direct challenge to his premise. He had expected defensive justification. He leaned forward. Slightly, by all means enlighten us about this data. The condescension in his voice was unmistakable. A murmur of amusement rippled through the audience. Exactly as he had intended. Caroline nodded, maintaining her composure. A recent Harvard Youth poll shows that on issues like economic opportunity, inflation, and cost of living, young voters are increasingly aligning with conservative positions. In fact, on these kitchen table issues, there's been a 12-point shift since 2020. Hayes waved his hand dismissively. Those are temporary concerns driven by post-pandemic factors. On fundamentals like climate change, social justice, healthcare, your party is wildly out of step with Generation Z and millennials. He gestured to one of his panelists, who jumped in immediately, the coordinated attack beginning. Young people are literally marching in the streets against the policies your party champions, she said, leaning forward. They see conservatives as actively threatening their future. Another panelist nodded, adding, the numbers don't lie. On issue after issue, from reproductive rights to student debt, young Americans reject conservative positions by massive margins. The third chimed in, and let's be honest, the rhetoric from your side has alienated diverse young voters completely. Caroline sat quietly, absorbing the barrage, waiting for the right moment. Hayes mistook her patience for weakness, smiling as he prepared to deliver what he thought would be his viral moment, the question designed not to illuminate, but to embarrass. So given all this, Ms. Levitt, how do you explain your party's strategy? Is it simply writing off an entire generation of voters, or is there a fundamental denial of reality happening among conservative leadership? He sat back, satisfied with his framing. The trap was set. The cameras zoomed in on Caroline. This was the moment Hayes had been waiting for, the moment where she would either fumble defensively or attempt to pivot awkwardly. Either way, he would press, interrupt, control the narrative. It was a strategy that had worked countless times before, with guests far more experienced than her. What Hayes didn't realize was that everything so far, the setup, the questions, the coordinated attacks, had gone exactly as Caroline had anticipated. She had been preparing for this moment her entire career. And what happened next would change everything. Her response would leave Hayes speechless, the panel stunned, and millions of viewers rethinking everything they thought they knew about the young conservative spokesperson who walked into a liberal news studio, seemingly outmatched, but hiding an ace up her sleeve, one that was about to flip the entire conversation on its head. The gleaming network studio buzzed with quiet energy, an hour before the confrontation that would soon go viral. Behind the carefully constructed set with its polished surfaces and strategic lighting, a machine was at work. Producers with clipboards and headsets rushed between rooms. Makeup artists touched up the panel members. Technicians adjusted microphones and tested sound levels. All choreographed chaos leading to a single moment. Morgan Hayes sat in his private dressing room. The name, plate on the door polished to a shine. Inside, he reviewed his notes one final time. Circling key phrases and potential attack lines, he had been the face of prime-time political commentary for nearly a decade now, his show consistently among the top-rated in its time slot. He had built his reputation on moments like these. Guests who walked in confident but left shaken, conservative voices who crumbled under his questioning, creating clips that would circulate for days, driving ratings higher and cementing his status as the voice progressive America trusted. A knock at the door interrupted his preparation. His executive producer, Diane, entered without waiting. "Morgan," she said, her voice hushed despite the closed door. "Final prep on the Levitt segment. We've pulled the latest polling data on youth voters and added those talking points to your document." Hayes nodded, not looking up from his notes. "How does she seem?" "Nervous," Diane said with a slight smile of satisfaction. "She's doing the usual routine, sipping water, reviewing her own notes, but she keeps checking her watch. Classic anxiety tell." Hayes allowed himself a small smile. "They always come in thinking they're ready," he said, circling another potential question. "They never are." Diane leaned against the wall. "The panel's prepped for your signals. Martin will hit her on climate denial, Rebecca on reproductive rights, and Nathan on the January 6th connection if she tries to pivot to economic talking points, which our research says is her comfort zone." Hayes nodded, pleased with the strategy. They had done this dozens of times before, the coordinated approach that left guests feeling surrounded, outnumbered, overwhelmed. It wasn't just an interview, it was a performance, a spectacle designed not to inform, but to entertain, to give the audience what they wanted, confirmation of what they already believed. He glanced at the TV monitor. Mounted in the corner, showing a feed from the main set, where Caroline Levitt was now being seated, she looked younger in person than in her photos, just 25 years old, one of the youngest press secretaries in recent history, now working as a conservative spokesperson. She wore a simple navy dress, conservative but not outdated. Her demeanor, calm as a makeup artist, made final touches to her appearance. There was something about her that gave Hayes pause just for a moment. Not nervousness, not exactly, but a composed alertness. He brushed the thought aside. He had faced far more experienced opponents, senators, governors, CEOs, and they had all stumbled under his questioning. He closed his folder, standing to adjust his tie in the mirror. "What are we expecting for audience composition tonight?" he asked, visualizing the crowd he would soon play to. "Heavily progressive," Diane replied, checking her tablet. "We're at about 85% left-leaning based on the ticket reservations and pre-screening." "Perfect," Hayes said, smoothing his tailored jacket. "They'll enjoy this." He took one final look at his reflection, practiced his camera-ready expression, somewhere between intellectual curiosity and moral certainty, then headed for the door. "Let's remind America why conservative policies are on the wrong side of history." And across the studio, Caroline sat perfectly still as the technician clipped a microphone to her dress, the bright lights already warming the air around her. She could feel the weight of eyes on her, the panel members stealing glances, the crew members making assumptions. The audience members already decided. This wasn't her first hostile interview, but it was perhaps the most lopsided, 4 against 1. Not counting Hayes himself, the odds were deliberately stacked against her. The floor director approached, clipboard in hand. 5 minutes, Miss Levitt. She confirmed the pronunciation of her name. Yes, thank you, Caroline replied, her voice warm, revealing none of the awareness that everyone here expected her to fail, expected her to become another viral moment, another example of conservative incompetence. She had watched Hayes dismantle her colleagues before, studied his techniques, observed his patterns, the way he interrupted to break momentum, the way he used selective facts to build false narratives, the way he signaled to his panel members when he wanted them. To pile on, she wasn't walking in blind, though that's exactly what they needed to believe. The set itself had been designed for psychological advantage. Her chair slightly lower than the others, the panel arranged in a subtle semicircle, positioning her as the outsider, the lighting harsher on her side of the desk. It was theatre. As much as journalism, and the script had been written long before she arrived, a producer approached the panel members, providing last-minute data points and talking points, their coordinated strategy barely concealed. One of them, Martin Kelsey, a climate journalist with a best-selling book on global warming, glanced toward Caroline, then whispered something to Rebecca Winters, a feminist author seated beside him. They both smirked, looking away quickly when they noticed Carolina watching them. The audience was being seated now, filling the studio with additional energy. They had come expecting entertainment, a public. Execution disguised as discourse. Tickets to Hayes's show were in high demand, especially when a conservative guest was scheduled. There was a blood sport quality to the viewership. They didn't want nuance or understanding. They wanted confirmation and catharsis. Caroline took a small sip of water, her mind clear, focused. Somewhere in the back of her thoughts, she could hear her father's voice, an army veteran, who had taught her that the most important battles are won before they're fought. Preparation, discipline, strategic thinking, these were her advantages, not platform, not numbers, not audience sympathy. Morgan Hayes entered the studio then. An immediate shift in energy followed him. Staff stood straighter, audience members whispered, camera operators adjusted their positions. He was the gravitational center of this space, his confidence radiating outward, affecting everyone around him. He approached the desk with practiced ease, nodding to his panel members like a general reviewing his troops before battle. Mr. Hayes, the floor director said, the countdown starts in 2 minutes. Hayes nodded, taking his seat at the center of the desk. Shuffling his notes with practiced nonchalance, he finally looked directly at Caroline, smiling with calculated warmth. Thank you for joining us, Ms. Levitt, he said, his voice different now, smoother for the upcoming performance. I hope you're prepared for a substantive conversation. Caroline smiled in return. I'm looking forward to it. He studied her for a moment, searching for weakness, finding none, but assuming it was there, hidden beneath the surface. The lighting director called for final positions. Camera operators confirmed their marks. The audience settled, quieter. Now, as the energy condensed, focused, Caroline took a final moment to center herself. This wasn't just another interview for her. It was an opportunity few in her position ever received. She had earned this moment through years of work, preparation, sacrifice, and she had no intention of wasting it, regardless of what Hayes and his panel had planned. 30 seconds, called the floor director. Hayes straightened imperceptibly, his expression shifting into its broadcast mode. The panel members leaned forward slightly, ready for their roles in the coming spectacle. The audience held a collective breath. 15 seconds. The red lights on the cameras illuminated, signaling they were about to go live. Hayes looked into the main camera, his expression now one of serious contemplation. 5, 4, 3. The studio fell completely silent. 2, 1. The theme music played through the studio speakers as the broadcast began. Millions of viewers tuning in across the country, unaware that they were about to witness something entirely unexpected, a moment that would be replayed, analyzed, discussed for weeks to come. The stage was set, the players in position. Morgan Hayes was about to begin his familiar performance, but this time, the ending would be anything but predictable. "Welcome back to the Hayes Report." Morgan's voice carried through the studio, smooth, authoritative, commanding attention. "Tonight we're discussing the future of conservatism and whether it has anything to offer young Americans." His eyebrows raised slightly for emphasis. Joining us is Caroline Leavitt, conservative spokesperson and former White House aide. The camera panned smoothly to Caroline, who nodded with a professional smile. The light, catching her face at an angle deliberately designed to create harsh shadows. "Thank you for having me, Morgan," she responded, her voice clear, steady, betraying none of the awareness that this was meant to be an ambush, not a discussion. Hayes leaned forward slightly, his posture shifting into interrogation mode. "So let's jump right in," he began, smiling with practiced insincerity. "Recent polling shows that among voters under 30, your party is losing ground at historic rates. On everything from climate policy to healthcare to basic democratic values." This wasn't a question. It was an opening statement designed to put her on defensive footing immediately, the framing suggesting she needed to explain herself before she'd even spoken. To be clear, Hayes continued before she could respond. Nearly 70% of young Americans view conservative policies as harmful to their future, and 65% believe the Republican Party doesn't respect basic democratic principles. How do you respond to an entire generation essentially rejecting your worldview? He sat back slightly, the trap laid. The audience murmured in agreement. The panel members watched intently, ready to pounce on whatever response she offered. Caroline took a breath. Collecting her thoughts, "That's certainly one interpretation of polling data," she began, her tone conversational, "but it doesn't tell the complete story." Before she could elaborate, Hayes cut in. "What complete story? Young voters are abandoning conservative candidates in record numbers. It's not an interpretation, it's a statistical reality." He gestured to one of his panelists, Martin Kelsey, whose book on climate change had been prominently displayed during the show's intro. Martin leaned forward. "I think what's happening is young people are simply more informed than previous generations. They understand the science on climate, they recognize social inequality when they see it, and they're not buying the same old conservative talking points that worked on their parents." He adjusted his glasses, looking directly at Caroline. "I mean, how can you possibly defend policies that will leave these kids with an uninhabitable planet?" Caroline began to respond. "I think young Americans care deeply about the environment, but they also—" Rebecca Winters, the feminist author on the panel, interrupted sharply. "They also care about their basic rights, which conservative policies are actively stripping away. Let's be honest here. Your party has launched an unprecedented attack on women's autonomy, reproductive freedom, LGBTQ rights, voting access." The audience applauded as she spoke, reinforcing the performance aspect of the program. Hayes nodded, allowing the interruption. These coordinated attacks were part of the strategy, the appearance of spontaneous outrage, actually carefully orchestrated. If Caroline tried to address one critique, another would immediately follow, creating the impression she was overwhelmed, unable to defend her positions. Nathan, the third panelist, jumped in. "And let's not forget January 6th polling shows. Young Americans were horrified by what they saw as an attack on democracy itself. How can you possibly expect Generation Z to support a movement tied to that event?" Hayes sat back, observing. This was going exactly according to plan. 3 attacks in rapid succession, no time for substantive response, the audience fully engaged. Nodding along with the panelists' points, it was the perfect setup, the kind of segment that would be clipped, shared across social media platforms with captions like, "Conservative spokesperson destroyed." He waited for Caroline to look flustered, to stumble over her words, to show frustration, but something unexpected happened instead. She remained perfectly composed, her expression thoughtful, as she listened, not defensive, not angry, just present. When the panelists finally paused, she simply smiled and addressed Hayes directly. That's quite a lot to unpack. Morgan, may I respond to these points now? Her tone wasn't combative or sarcastic, just matter of fact. Hayes nodded magnanimously. Please, by all means. He expected her to launch into rehearsed talking points, defensive justifications, the typical conservative playbook. He was already planning his follow-up interruption. Caroline straightened slightly in her chair. First, I want to acknowledge something important. Young Americans are passionate, engaged, and deeply concerned about their future. That's something we should all celebrate. Regardless of political affiliation, this wasn't the defensive posture Hayes expected. It threw him slightly off balance, she continued. But I think we're making a fundamental error when we treat young voters as a monolith, as if millions of diverse individuals with different backgrounds, experiences, and concerns all think exactly the same way. Hayes felt a subtle shift in the energy of the room. This wasn't following the expected script. He needed to regain control. Well, the polling clearly shows, Caroline continued seamlessly, for instance. While climate change is certainly a concern, recent Gallup polling shows that among voters under 30, economic issues actually rank higher. Inflation, cost of living, housing affordability, these are the immediate pressures many young Americans face. She turned slightly to include the audience in her response, not just addressing Hayes, but expanding the conversation. Young people aren't just worried about the future of the planet. They're worried about whether they can afford to live now, whether they can buy a home, start a family, pay off student debt while managing basic expenses. Martin tried to interject, but that's precisely why progressive policies. Caroline acknowledged him with a nod, then pivoted back to her point. What's interesting is that on economic issues, we're actually seeing a shift, with younger voters increasingly skeptical of big government solutions. A Harvard Youth poll from last quarter showed substantial gains for conservative economic approaches among voters under 25. Precisely because many young Americans want opportunity more than guarantees. Hayes felt the momentum slipping. This wasn't a flustered, defensive opponent. This was someone who had come prepared, with data, with counterpoints, with a strategy of her own. He needed to change tactics quickly. So your answer to young voters is essentially to ignore the climate crisis, ignore social justice concerns, and focus on tax cuts for the wealthy. His voice carried a slight edge now, the casual disdain that had won him viral moments. Before, Caroline didn't take the bait. That's not at all what I said, Morgan, and I think presenting it that way doesn't give your viewers the honest conversation they deserve. There was a slight murmur from the audience, not the usual agreeable response to Hayes' framing, but something different, more attentive, as if they were actually listening to both sides now. Hayes signaled to Rebecca, hoping she could re-establish the planned dynamic. She leaned forward aggressively. Let's talk about reproductive rights, then. Your party has consistently undermined women's autonomy. How do you defend that to young women who overwhelmingly support reproductive freedom? This was supposed to be the knockout question, the one topic conservative guests typically struggled with, especially on a progressive network with a liberal audience. Caroline turned toward Rebecca directly. I appreciate your passion on this issue, and I understand why it matters deeply to many Americans, young and old alike. She paused briefly, ensuring her next words would land with full impact. But I think we do young voters a disservice when we assume they're single-issue voters, or that they can't hold nuanced positions on complex ethical questions. The research actually shows that Gen Z is more comfortable with moral complexity than previous generations. They don't always want simplified narratives or absolute positions. Hayes felt the controls slipping further away. This wasn't at all what he had expected. The young conservative wasn't playing defense. She wasn't getting flustered by interruptions. She wasn't falling into the traps he had laid. Worst of all, she was coming across as reasonable, thoughtful, well-informed, the exact opposite of the caricature he had planned to present to his viewers. He needed to recalibrate quickly before this segment went completely off the rails. Caroline wasn't just surviving this interview, she was somehow taking command of it, and none of his usual tactics seemed to be working. He glanced at his producer off-camera, who looked equally concerned. This was supposed to be a routine takedown, an easy win, a clip that would boost ratings, reinforce their viewers' existing beliefs. Instead, it was becoming something unexpected, something potentially dangerous to the narrative they had carefully constructed. Hayes cleared his throat, preparing to launch a more direct, more personal line of questioning, one that would surely throw her off balance. Little did he know, Caroline had anticipated this exact moment, and what would happen next would change the entire dynamic of the show. Morgan Hayes shifted in his chair, leaning forward with renewed intensity, his expression hardening into something sharper, more personal than before. "Ms. Levitt," he began, his voice carrying a new edge, "let's move beyond these abstract discussions and talk about something more concrete." The audience sensing the shift, the energy in the studio tightening like air before a storm. "You worked in the Trump administration. You've defended policies that experts widely condemn as harmful, xenophobic, even dangerous." His words hanging in the air, a direct challenge, impossible to sidestep. How do you personally justify working for and continuing to support an administration that separated children from their parents at the border, that undermined critical climate agreements, that spread dangerous misinformation? During a pandemic, the studio fell completely silent, camera operators zooming in to capture her reaction. This, the moment Hayes had been building toward. The direct moral challenge designed not to illuminate, but to condemn, to create a viral moment of apparent, ethical checkmate. Caroline's expression remained composed, though something flickered behind her eyes, recognition of what was happening, awareness of the trap being laid. Before she could respond, Martin jumped in. "Let's be specific here. The administration you worked for pulled out of the Paris Climate Accord, effectively abandoning global climate cooperation at a critical moment." Rebecca nodding, adding fuel to the attack. "And let's not forget the systematic dismantling of reproductive protections, setting women's rights back decades." Nathan completing. "The coordinated assault, plus the documented attempts to undermine election results and democratic processes, which many experts have called unprecedented." Hayes sat back slightly, watching as the panelists delivered the punches he had orchestrated. The audience reacting now, some nodding in agreement, others murmuring their approval. This the spectacle they had come for, the public trial of conservative ideology, with Hayes as both prosecutor and judge. He allowed the moment to build. Let the weight of accusation settle before turning back. To Caroline, "These aren't just policy disagreements, Ms. Levitt. These are serious ethical concerns. Don't young Americans deserve better than this?" His tone suggesting there was no acceptable answer, only degrees of guilt to be assigned. The panel members watching intently, certain they were witnessing the beginning of her unraveling, the cameras capturing every moment, the harsh studio lights leaving nowhere to hide, the trap complete. The pressure maximum. By any reasonable expectation, this should have been the breaking point, the moment where composure cracked, where defensive justifications began, where the interview spiraled into exactly the kind of clip Hayes had planned for, but something unexpected happened instead. Caroline took a deep breath, her posture straightening ever so slightly, and then she smiled, not defensively, not nervously, but with a calm certainty that was immediately unsettling to everyone who had expected her collapse. "Morgan," she said, her voice level, "I notice you've shifted from policy discussions to personal attacks rather quickly." Hayes blinked, surprised by her direct observation. "I'm simply asking you to defend your own record." he countered, recovering quickly. It's a fair question. Caroline nodded slightly. It would be if that were truly your intent. But we both know this isn't. But understanding my perspective, or having a good faith discussion about complex issues. The studio temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. This wasn't the response anyone had anticipated. Hayes furrowed his brow. Are you suggesting I'm not asking in good faith? His tone carrying a warning, careful territory ahead. Carolina met his gaze directly. I'm stating it plainly. You didn't invite me here for a discussion. You invited me here for a public execution. She gestured to the panel. The setup, the framing, the coordinated questions. This isn't journalism, Morgan, it's theatre. Gasps rippling through the audience. No one speaking to Hayes this way on his own show. Certainly not a guest who was supposed to be on the defensive. Hayes, feeling a flash of anger, quickly suppressed, replacing it with a practiced chuckle. That's quite an accusation, Ms. Levitt. Perhaps it's easier than answering difficult questions. Caroline shaking her head. I'm happy to answer difficult questions, but that would require you actually being interested in my answers rather than in creating viral moments. Several audience members shifting uncomfortably in their seats. The dynamic changing in a way no one expected. Hayes glancing at his producer, who was watching with growing concern, the segment veering dangerously off script. Well then, let's try again, he said with forced patience. How do you defend the border policies, specifically the family separation that traumatized thousands of children? His tone suggesting this was his checkmate move. The question no conservative could answer adequately, especially not on a progressive network with a liberal audience. Caroline nodding, accepting the challenge. First, I think it's important to acknowledge that immigration policy is incredibly complex, with genuine humanitarian concerns on all sides. The panel members exchanging glances. This wasn't the defensive non-answer they expected. She continued, the reality at the border involves difficult trade-offs between compassion, immediate safety concerns, deterrence, human trafficking prevention, and long-term solutions to migration pressures. I don't believe anyone, regardless of party, wants to see families separated or children suffering. Hayes trying to interrupt. But that's exactly what... Caroline continuing smoothly. What's interesting is that many of the border facilities and policies that received intense criticism existed before and continued after that administration, which raises important questions about our collective responsibility beyond partisan finger-pointing. The audience completely silent now. Not the hostile silence of before, but the attentive silence of people actually listening. Hayes feeling the momentum slipping further away. This wasn't how these segments were supposed to go. The guest not following the expected script, not becoming defensive, not crumbling under the weight of moral accusation, not providing the easily dismissed sound bites he had counted on. Worse, she was somehow turning his own format against him, speaking directly to his audience in a way that was landing with unexpected effectiveness. Rebecca attempting to redirect. But you personally worked for an administration that enacted these harmful policies. How do you sleep at night knowing you contributed to that? A desperate attempt to re-establish the moral high ground the interview had been designed around. Caroline turning to her directly. I appreciate the question, Rebecca, though I note the assumption of bad faith embedded in it. Pausing, letting the observation land. I sleep at night knowing that I've worked in service to principles I believe create the greatest good for the most people, including those most vulnerable, just as I imagine you sleep at night believing in your own principles. There's a difference between disagreeing with someone and assuming they must be morally bankrupt to hold different views on complex issues. A murmur spreading through the audience. Not agreement necessarily, but something Hayes feared even more, thoughtful consideration, Martin jumping in, his tone condescending. These aren't just different views. The science on climate change is settled. Conservative policies are objectively harmful to future generations. Caroline nodding. Science should absolutely inform policy, but policy decisions involve values, judgments about trade-offs, priorities, and approaches that go beyond scientific findings themselves, turning slightly, including the audience in her response. For instance, we all agree climate change is real, but reasonable people can disagree on whether massive government spending, higher energy costs, and increased regulations are the most effective approach, especially when those burdens fall heaviest on working-class Americans already struggling with inflation and economic uncertainty. Hayes feeling the segment slipping completely beyond his control, something that had never happened before on his own show. This was supposed to be a straightforward takedown, an easy win for his audience to cheer. Instead, it had somehow transformed into an actual conversation, one where his guest wasn't playing the role assigned to her, wasn't being the conservative caricature his audience expected and wanted, wasn't providing the easy target for mockery and dismissal. His producer now signaling frantically from off-camera they needed to go to commercial break, to regroup, to revise the strategy. But Hayes knowing what that would look like, it would look like retreat, like defeat, something he had never experienced on his own show, his expression darkening slightly. Fine, let's be direct then, would you say? You're proud of your work in that administration? The question delivered like a prosecutor's final thrust. Certain of conviction, Caroline not hesitating. I'm proud of fighting for policies that created the lowest unemployment rate in 50 years, that saw real wages rising for working Americans, that prioritized peace through strength in foreign policy. And yes, I'm proud of continuing to advocate for the millions of Americans who believe in borders, in economic opportunity, in constitutional rights, and traditional values. Her voice not loud, but carrying conviction that resonated even in this hostile environment. Hayes realizing with growing alarm that she wasn't just surviving this interview. She was somehow using it, using his own platform, his own format, to speak directly to viewers in a way that was disarmingly effective. And what happened next would leave not just Hayes, but the entire panel speechless as Caroline prepared to deliver the response that would ultimately change everything. Hayes leaned forward, his jaw tightening slightly, a shift in tactics evident in his posture. Let's talk about January 6th. Then his voice carried a new sharpness, an edge that had cut down many guests before the studio seemed to hold its breath. This was his signature move, the moral question that left no room for nuance. You continue to support a movement that many Americans view as fundamentally dangerous to democracy itself. His words hung in the air, accusatory final. Do you understand why young voters, particularly those from marginalized communities, view your party with genuine fear? The question wasn't designed for answer, but for damage, for viral clips for the moment. Of sputtering defense, he had executed this move dozens of times before, and it rarely failed to deliver. The audience leaned forward. The cameras zoomed in, capturing every micro-expression the panel members watched intently, certain they were about to witness the collapse. Caroline's hands rested lightly on the desk before her for the first time. A subtle shift in her demeanor appeared. Not nervousness, not anger, but something deeper, more personal. The studio lights caught a momentary softness. In her eyes, something genuine breaking through the professional veneer. She took a breath, and the studio waited. What happened next was unexpected. Instead of launching into a defensive response or political talking points, her voice when she spoke was quieter, more reflective, almost intimate. Before I answer that, Morgan, I'd like to share something personal if you'll allow me. Hayes blinked, caught off guard by the shift. He nodded, slightly curious. Despite himself, my grandfather was a world. War II veteran, she began her tone conversational, as though speaking to individuals, not to cameras. He stormed the beaches of Normandy at 19 years old, younger than many of the college students we're talking about tonight. He rarely spoke about what he saw there, but he carried those memories his entire life. The audience stilled completely. This wasn't the response anyone had expected. Hayes shifted, slightly unsure where this was going, but aware that interrupting now would appear callous. Even to his supporters, Caroline continued, he fought against actual fascism. Morgan, not the kind we accuse each other of on social media, but the real thing, men who were genuinely trying to end democracy. She paused, letting the weight of that settle. One thing he told me before he passed was that the greatest threat to America wouldn't come from outside our borders, but from our inability to see each other as fellow Americans first. Before our political identities, Hayes found himself momentarily speechless. This wasn't in the script, wasn't the defensive justification he had anticipated, wasn't something he could easily dismiss or mock. The cameras captured the subtle change. In the studio, the shift from spectacle to something else, something genuine. When you asked me about January 6th, Caroline continued, her voice steady. I can tell you unequivocally that I condemn political violence of any kind from any side, full stop. Her eyes met Hayes's directly. The simplicity of the statement left no room for the attack he had planned. But I think the bigger question, the one that actually matters to most Americans, is how we move forward, how we rebuild trust in our institutions, how we remember that behind our political differences are human beings, with families, hopes, fears, dreams, just like our own. The panel members exchanged glances. This wasn't going according to plan. Nathan tried to redirect. But your party continues. 2. Caroline held up her hand gently, not aggressive, but firm. I believe you've all had your chance to speak. She said, her tone respectful but unwavering, and I'd appreciate the same courtesy. The audience murmured their surprising approval. Hayes felt the control of his own show slipping further away. What made the moment so powerful wasn't just what she was saying, but how she was saying it without the performative anger, the rehearsed outrage, the talking points that defined most political discourse. She continued, my generation, regardless of political affiliation, is tired of the endless cycle of accusation, the assumption of bad faith, the idea that our political opponents aren't just wrong but evil. She gestured to the panel, to Hayes himself. This format, this setup, it's designed not for understanding, but for entertainment, for confirming biases, for creating viral moments of conflict. Several audience members nodded. Others sat straighter, paying closer attention. Hayes glanced at his producer, who appeared frozen, watching a train wreck in slow motion. The broadcast taking a turn no one had scripted. Young Americans aren't running from conservative values. Caroline said, her voice gathering quiet strength. They're running from the toxic ways both parties often express their values. They're looking for authenticity, for nuance, for people who care more about solving problems than winning news cycles. She turned slightly, including the audience directly in a way Hayes rarely allowed his guests to do. I grew up in a small town in New Hampshire where neighbors with Biden and Trump signs still helped each other when storms knocked out. Power still coached each other's kids in Little League, still recognized their shared humanity beyond their political differences. Something had changed in the studio completely now, a tangible shift in energy. Hayes recognized it with growing alarm. His audience was listening to her, actually listening, not waiting for her to fail, not hoping for a memorable takedown, but engaged with what she was saying. It was unprecedented on his show. Rebecca tried one more time to regain control, but these are matters of life and death. For many communities, climate change, reproductive rights, voting access. How can you equate that with just differences of opinion? Caroline turned to her with surprising gentleness. I'm not equating or minimizing those concerns, Rebecca. They are vitally important conversations we need to have. The disagreement isn't about whether these issues matter. It's about the most effective approaches to address them and whether we can discuss those approaches without assuming the worst about each other. Hayes watched as his own audience, people who had come for Bloodsport for the takedown of a Conservative spokesperson, were nodding along with her words. It was like watching a magician perform an impossible trick in real time. He needed to break this spell quickly, but his usual tool's interruption, mockery, dismissal, seemed suddenly inadequate, even counterproductive. Ms. Levitt, he began, his voice carrying a forced authority that sounded hollow even to him. These are nice platitudes, but they don't address the very real harm Conservative policies cause. It was a desperate attempt to reframe the conversation, to reassert the moral hierarchy the show depended on. Caroline met his gaze directly. That's exactly the framing that's failing young voters, Morgan. The insistence that one side has a monopoly on compassion, on solutions, on moral authority. She leaned forward, slightly, her next words delivered with quiet conviction that landed with surprising force. Young Americans are smart enough to recognize when they're being spoken to authentically and when they're being used as political props in someone else's narrative. The words hung in the air. Hayes felt them land like a physical blow, not because they were aggressive, but because they were true. His entire format, his entire brand depended on exactly that. Using outrage as entertainment, using guests as props in a predetermined narrative. And somehow, in the space of a few minutes, this young Conservative woman had exposed it all, had turned his own stage against him, had connected with his audience in a way he never anticipated. The silence that followed was deafening, a silence that carried more impact than any shouted argument could have achieved. What happened next would transform not just this interview, not just this broadcast, but conversations across America as viewers witnessed something they hadn't seen in years on political television, authentic human connection across the deepest political divides. The silence that had fallen over the studio lingered for what felt like an eternity, but was in reality only seconds. The cameras captured it all. The stunned expressions of the panelists, the audience members leaning forward in their seats, and Morgan Hayes, for perhaps the first time in his broadcasting career, completely at a loss for words. He shuffled his notes reflexively, a nervous gesture he never allowed himself on camera. "Let's take a step back," he finally said, his voice carrying none of the confidence that had defined his career. "You've spoken about tone and approach, but let's get back to actual policy." It was a desperate attempt to reclaim familiar ground, to return to the script that had worked so well before, but something fundamental had shifted. The energy in the room, the dynamic of the conversation, the very nature of this exchange had been irreversibly transformed. Caroline nodded slightly. "I'm happy to discuss specific policies, Morgan, but I think we've been doing that all along." Her voice carried a quiet certainty now, not the defensive posture of a guest under siege, but the confidence of someone who had found her footing. "The problem is that we've been discussing them through a framework designed to create conflict rather than understanding." She gestured subtly to the panel, to the set itself. Rather than asking how conservative policies might actually help the concerns young Americans have, the entire framing has been, "Why are you so terrible?" Hayes felt a flush of heat rise to his face, visible even under the studio makeup. "That's a convenient deflection," he countered, his tone sharper now, driven by the unfamiliar sensation of losing control. "I've asked specific questions about specific policies, health, care, climate, immigration, and you've responded with platitudes about civility." It was a desperate counterattack, but Caroline didn't flinch. "Actually, Morgan, I've offered specific perspectives on each of those issues, explaining the reasoning behind conservative approaches. But each time I did, you or the panel interrupted, to shift to a new accusation, Her words weren't heated, they were factual, and therein lay their power. The audience murmured in agreement, several nodding noticeably. Hayes glanced off camera where his producer was making frantic cutting motions, signaling to go to commercial, to end this segment that had gone so catastrophically off script. But Hayes couldn't do it, couldn't concede defeat so publicly. His reputation, his brand depended on winning these exchanges, on always having the last word. "All right then," he said, forcing a tight smile. "Let's be very specific. The conservative position on climate change has consistently been to deny, prioritize profits, and block meaningful regulation. Defend that to the generation that will inherit the consequences." He delivered the challenge like a prosecutor, certain this direct approach would finally corner her, but Caroline didn't respond immediately. Instead, she paused, considering the question not as a trap to avoid, but as a genuine inquiry. "I think that framing itself reveals the problem with how we discuss these issues," she began. "The assumption that one side has no concern for future generations is precisely why young Americans are tuning out political discourse." "Agreed." Hayes tried to interrupt, but she continued. "Conservatives and progressives both want a cleaner, healthier planet for future generations. The disagreement isn't about whether climate change matters, it's about the most effective approaches, balancing immediate economic impacts on working families with long-term environmental goals." Her tone was reasonable, measured, the kind of voice rarely heard on political television. She turned slightly to include the audience. "Conservatives believe innovation, market incentives, and American energy independence can drive environmental progress without sacrificing jobs, economic growth, or national security. You can disagree with that approach, but characterizing it as not caring about the planet isn't accurate or productive." Martin, the climate journalist on the panel, leaned forward, his expression dismissive. "That's a convenient reframing, but the science demands immediate, dramatic action, not market-based incrementalism." Caroline turned to him directly. "The science tells us what's happening, Martin. Policy decisions involve judgments about how to respond, and those judgments include considerations beyond scientific findings themselves, such as economic impacts, distributional concerns, and unintended consequences. Most Americans, including young Americans, want practical solutions that improve environmental outcomes without devastating their economic opportunities." Several audience members nodded visibly now, some even murmured agreement. Hayes watched with growing alarm as his own audience, the progressive crowd that filled his studio for every taping, was responding to her points. Rebecca jumped in, her voice sharp with frustration. "What about reproductive rights? You can't possibly claim conservative policies align with what young women want." Caroline turned to her, maintaining the same measured tone. "I appreciate how deeply people feel about this issue on both sides, precisely because it involves fundamental questions about life, autonomy, and care." She paused, ensuring her words were measured. "Polling consistently shows Americans, including young Americans, hold nuanced views on this topic, not the absolutist positions political extremes often present. Many support some limitations and protections, while opposing total bans. A recent Gallup poll showed 67% of Americans support first trimester access, while 65% support limitations after that. The complexity of those views isn't captured in our political discourse." Hayes felt the ground shifting beneath him. This wasn't how these segments were supposed to go. This wasn't the predictable exchange of rehearsed talking points. The performer attacking from her conservative script, while he countered with progressive certainties. She was somehow transcending the format itself, speaking directly to viewers in a way that resonated regardless of their political alignment. More dangerous still, she was exposing the artifice of his entire approach, the predetermined nature of these political confrontations. "Let's be clear," he interrupted, his voice carrying an edge of desperation. Conservatives have consistently opposed policies that would benefit young Americans: student debt relief, climate action, health care expansion, affordable housing. Initiatives, his tone sharpened, accusatory. These aren't matters of tone or approach. These are concrete policies your party has blocked while offering no meaningful alternatives. It was his last stand, his final attempt to re-establish the narrative frame that had served him so well. If he could just force her back into defending, into justifying, into the role he had assigned, perhaps this segment could still be salvaged. Caroline looked at him directly. "I understand this format requires conflict, Morgan," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "But I think your viewers deserve more than that. I think they deserve an actual conversation about these important issues." Hayes felt a chill run down his spine. She wasn't just refusing to play the assigned role, she was commenting on the role itself, exposing the performance for what it was. The audience was completely silent now, watching, not with the eager anticipation of conflict, but with genuine interest in what would come next. Conservative policies focus on creating conditions for opportunity and mobility, she continued, through economic growth, deregulation, support for families and communities, and protection of fundamental freedoms. Progressives believe more government programs, more spending, more centralized control is the path to helping people. That's a genuine philosophical difference with real-world implications, but it's not a difference between caring and not caring, between good and evil, between helping young people and hurting them. The simplicity and reasonableness of her framing made Hayes' usual approach seem suddenly shallow, performative rather than substantive. She had somehow, within the space of a few minutes, reframed the entire conversation, not just about policy, but about how we discuss policy. The cameras panned across the studio, capturing the attentive faces of audience members, the concerned expressions of the panelists, and Morgan Hayes, visibly struggling to maintain his composure as the carefully constructed format of his show, the very foundation of his brand, was being dismantled before a live audience by the very person who was supposed to be his victim. What happened next would be replayed millions of times, shared across every social media platform, dissected on competing networks, and discussed in living rooms across America as the moment political television changed forever. The studio fell into a silence so complete you could hear the soft hum of the air conditioning, the gentle whir of camera motors adjusting as they captured the moment unfolding. An audience member in the third row, a woman in her early 30s with dark-rimmed glasses, broke the silence first. "I actually agree with her," she said, her voice cutting through the tension. Not loud, but clear enough to be heard. Carried by the studio microphones, heads turned toward her, surprised this wasn't part of the show. Audience members weren't supposed to speak unless explicitly invited by Hayes. But something had shifted. In the room, the carefully maintained barrier between performance and reality had cracked. Another voice from the back row. "I came here expecting something completely different." A middle-aged man in a blue button-down shirt. "I didn't expect to actually listen." Murmurs spread through the audience, a ripple effect of whispers and nods. Hayes watched in growing horror as his own audience, the carefully screened, predominantly progressive crowd that filled his studio for every broadcast, was breaking script, responding to Caroline not as a conservative villain to be mocked, but as a voice worth hearing. His producer was frantically signaling now, making a cutting motion across her throat, her expression one of barely contained panic. 30 seconds. A voice spoke into Hayes's earpiece. "We need to go to commercial now." Hayes cleared his throat, shifting in his chair. "Well, this has certainly been an interesting discussion," he began, his voice strained, attempting casual control. "We'll continue after this short break." But before the cameras could cut away, Caroline spoke one last time. "Thank you, Morgan, for allowing this conversation to happen." Her words carried no sarcasm, no edge, just simple gratitude. But everyone in the studio knew what had actually transpired. The facade had been broken, the curtain pulled back, the mechanics of the performance exposed. As the commercial break began, the studio erupted into a buzz of conversation, unlike anything that had happened before. Audience members turning to each other, discussing what they'd just witnessed, some agreeing, some disagreeing, but all engaged in actual dialogue, not the predictable partisan responses the show was designed to reinforce. Hayes ripped his microphone off, striding toward his producer, his face flushed with barely contained fury. "What the hell just happened?" he hissed, keeping his voice low but intense. "How did we lose control of this?" The producer shook her head. "I don't know, we've never had a guest do that before." Across the studio, Caroline remained seated, taking a small sip of water, maintaining her composure as several audience members approached the stage, wanting to continue the conversation. One of the production assistants moved to stop them. But Caroline gestured that it was okay, leaning forward to speak with them, breaking yet another unwritten rule of the show. Guests didn't engage directly with the audience, didn't break the fourth wall. Everything was supposed to be mediated, controlled, packaged, but those boundaries had been shattered now. Hayes watched from across the studio as Caroline spoke with audience members, listening intently to their questions, responding with the same measured thoughtfulness she had shown on air. It was as if she had created a different kind of show entirely, one based on actual exchange rather than performance. Martin and Rebecca huddled together, their expressions concerned, confused. Nathan stood checking his phone, already seeing the initial social media response. "It's blowing up," he said, his voice tight. "Clips are already circulating, and they're not the ones we wanted." The studio. Director approached Hayes, his expression grim. 4 minutes to air. We need to adjust the second segment. What's the new approach?" Hayes ran a hand through his hair, a nervous gesture he never allowed on camera. "We stick to the plan," he said finally, his voice carrying forced confidence. "We come back hard on policy specifics. Keep it focused. Rapid-fire questions." "No. Time for her to control the narrative." The director nodded, but his expression conveyed clear skepticism. Hayes returned to his seat, adjusting his tie, trying to recapture the commanding presence that had defined his broadcasting career. The panel members took their positions, exchanging uncertain glances as Caroline continued speaking with audience members until the last possible moment. 30 seconds, the floor director called. Caroline returned to her seat, thanking the audience members with a warm smile. Hayes didn't look at her, focusing instead on his notes, preparing his counter-offensive, but the energy had shifted irreversibly. The audience was watching her now, not with hostility or skepticism, but with genuine curiosity, interest, even respect. 3, 2, 1. The red lights on. The cameras illuminated as the broadcast resumed. "Welcome back to the Hayes Report," Hayes began, his voice carrying the practiced authority he was known for. "In our remaining time, we want to focus on specific policies." He turned to Caroline, his expression challenging. "Ms. Levitt, let's discuss economic approaches. You've suggested conservative economic policies benefit young Americans when all evidence shows millennials and Gen Z are struggling with unprecedented financial challenges." It was an attempt to regain control, to return to the familiar territory of accusation and defense. But something unexpected happened. An audience member raised her hand, a young woman in the front row. Hayes tried to ignore her, continuing his question. "How do you justify tax policies that—" "Excuse me," the young woman called out, her voice clear enough to be picked up by the microphones. "I have a question about what Ms. Levitt said earlier." The studio fell silent again. This had never happened in the show's history. An audience member interrupting the host, speaking without being called on. Hayes froze momentarily, uncertain how to respond. His producer was already speaking into his earpiece. "Ignore her. Keep going." But the cameras had already captured. It had already shown the young woman standing, the attention of the studio shifting to her. Hayes felt control, slipping completely away now. "What was your question?" he asked finally. His tone revealing the strain of maintaining composure. The young woman looked directly at Carolina. "You mentioned innovation and market approaches to environmental challenges. Can you explain what specific solutions conservatives support, beyond just opposing regulations?" It was a genuine question, not an attack, not a setup, just an actual inquiry from someone interested in understanding. And in this moment, the transformation of the show was complete. What had begun as a carefully orchestrated takedown had become something entirely different, something authentic. Caroline nodded, appreciating the question. "Thank you for asking," she began. As she started to explain specific policy alternatives, carbon capture technologies, nuclear energy development, market incentives for renewable innovation, the cameras captured something remarkable. Audience members were taking notes, leaning forward, engaged, some nodding, others looking skeptical, but all of them actually listening. Hayes watched helplessly as his show, the platform he had built around conflict, performance, and predetermined narratives, transformed before his eyes into something he had never intended, never wanted. Actual dialogue, a genuine exchange of ideas. The panel members sat silent, their rehearsed attacks suddenly irrelevant in this new, unexpected reality, where understanding, not victory, had become the shared objective. From the control room, the executive producer watched in disbelief as ratings data streamed across his monitor. Viewership wasn't dropping, it was climbing. Social media mentions were exploding, but not with the usual partisan reactions. Instead, comments reflected surprise, appreciation for seeing something rare in political media. Actual substance. Actual listening, actual respect across deep divides. When the young woman's question had been answered, another hand went up, then another. Hayes realized with growing dread that he had lost control, not just temporarily, but fundamentally. His audience was no longer following his lead. They were engaged in a conversation he hadn't scripted, couldn't control as the questions continued, as Caroline responded to each with thoughtful nuance, as audience members began sharing their own perspectives, sometimes agreeing, sometimes challenging, but always with genuine respect. Hayes sat, watching the transformation of everything he had built, his expression unreadable, but his thoughts in complete turmoil. What would happen next would change not just this broadcast, not just his career, but potentially the very nature of political discourse in America, as viewers witnessed a glimpse of what conversation could be when freed from the constraints of performative outrage. The studio lights dimmed, the cameras powered down, the audience filtered out, still buzzing with conversation, discussing what they had witnessed. An event that had begun as political theater and ended as something entirely different. Hayes sat alone at the desk, his microphone removed, his notes scattered, staring into the middle distance as crew members dismantled the set around him. The interview had finally concluded, not with the viral takedown he had planned, but with something unprecedented. A genuine conversation that had left everyone, including him, profoundly unsettled. Across the studio, Caroline gathered her things, surrounded by a small group of audience members who had lingered, hoping to continue the discussion. Their expressions animated, engaged, some agreeing, some challenging, but all of them genuinely interested in what she had to say. Hayes watched from a distance, trying to process what had happened, how, in the space of 60 minutes, his carefully constructed formula had collapsed, how this young conservative spokesperson had somehow transformed his own show into a referendum on political discourse itself. His executive producer approached, tablet in hand, face grim. "The numbers are in," she said simply. Hayes looked up, waiting for the damage report. the confirmation that this disaster had tanked their viewership. It's our highest-rated segment in 3 years. 20 minutes in, viewership jumped 40%. Social media engagement is through the roof. Hayes blinked, not understanding. "That doesn't make sense," he said, his voice hollow. "We lost control. The narrative fell apart." The producer nodded in agreement. "I know, but people are responding. They're calling it authentic, revolutionary. Even viewers who disagree with her politically are saying it's the most honest political discussion they've seen on television in years." She scrolled through her tablet, reading comments as they poured in, finally saw real conversation instead of talking points. "Watched the whole thing standing up in my living room. Completely disagree with her politics, but respect her approach. Is this what political discourse could actually be?" Hayes felt the floor shift beneath him. His entire career had been built on a particular kind of political entertainment: conflict, outrage, predetermined narratives, packaged for maximum emotional response and minimum actual understanding. But what if viewers wanted something else? What if the audience he had cultivated, hungry for confirmation of their existing beliefs, also hungered for something deeper, more authentic? Across the emptying studio, he watched as Caroline finished her conversations, thanking the remaining audience members before gathering her notes and heading toward the exit. There was no triumph in her demeanor, no celebration of victory, just the quiet confidence of someone who had come to have a real conversation and had somehow managed to create the space for one against overwhelming odds. Hayes stood, making a decision that surprised even himself. He approached her near the exit. "Miss Leavitt," he called, his voice stripped of its broadcasting polish. Caroline turned, a question in her expression. "Mr. Hayes?" Hayes stopped a few feet from her, awkward, uncertain. This wasn't a moment he had scripted. "That was, he began, then stopped, recalibrating. "That was not what I expected." Caroline smiled slightly. "Me neither, to be honest." There was a pause, fragile, tentative. "I'd like to have you back on the show," Hayes heard himself say, the words surprising him as much as her. Caroline studied him for a moment, trying to gauge his sincerity. "For another ambush?" she asked finally, her tone not accusatory, just direct. Hayes shook his head. "No, for an actual conversation." This time he managed a small, self-deprecating smile. "Ratings suggest people might actually want that." Caroline nodded, considering the offer. "I'd be happy to return under those conditions. No stacked panels, no predetermined narratives, just honest dialogue about important issues." Hayes extended his hand. She took it, a brief professional handshake. Then she was gone, leaving Hayes standing alone in his rapidly emptying studio, contemplating what had just transpired and what it might mean for everything that followed. Meanwhile, outside the studio, in the real world beyond the carefully constructed set, the interview was already spreading like wildfire across the digital landscape. Clips were being shared at unprecedented rates, not the usual partisan excerpts, designed to inflame one side against the other, but longer segments that captured the transformation of the conversation itself. The moment Caroline had called out the format, the audience member who had spoken up, the genuine exchange that followed. Political commentators across the spectrum were struggling to categorize what they had seen. Conservatives claiming victory, progressives arguing she had dodged hard questions, but a surprising number on both sides acknowledging something important had happened, something that transcended the usual us versus them framing. CNN analyst: "The video isn't going viral because she owned the libs or crushed the host. It's viral because people are starved for authenticity, for conversations that don't insult their intelligence." Fox commentator: "This young woman demonstrated what conservative communication should look like: substantive, reasoned, unafraid, and most importantly, effective." MSNBC host, I disagree with virtually everything she said, but I can't deny she changed the format of that show through sheer force of authenticity, and we in media need to pay attention to why that resonates. Twitter was exploding with reactions, each clip generating thousands of comments, many from young viewers who rarely engaged with traditional political programming. This is the first political interview I've watched in years where I didn't feel my intelligence was insulted. Why can't we have more conversations like this? Completely disagree with her politics, but at least she talks to people, not at them. In news organization boardrooms across the country, executives were watching the numbers with interest. The unexpected surge in viewership, the cross-demographic appeal, the sustained engagement, all suggesting something their focus groups and consultants had missed, that beneath the appetite for conflict and confirmation lay a deeper hunger for substance, for authenticity, for conversations that acknowledged complexity rather than reducing everything to simplistic battles. Caroline's phone didn't stop buzzing as she made her way back to her hotel. Interview requests flooded in from every major network and platform, her social media followers increasing by thousands with each passing hour. But she didn't check the numbers, didn't read the commentary, didn't engage with the suddenly frenzied interest in her perspective. Instead, she called her grandfather, the World War II veteran she had mentioned during the interview. "Hey, Grandpa," she said when he answered. "How did it go?" His voice weathered but clear. "Did you say what you needed to say?" She smiled, looking out the car window at the city passing by. "I did, and I think people actually listened. That's all you can hope for," he replied, the wisdom of 98 years in his voice. "Say what you believe, listen to others with respect, and trust that truth has a power all its own." Across town, in his corner office, Morgan Hayes sat watching clips of the interview, seeing himself through new eyes, the performative outrage, the constant interruptions, the predetermined framing, all of it suddenly appearing hollow, even to him. Beside him on the desk lay multiple phone messages from the network executives, urgent meeting requests to discuss the surprising ratings, the overwhelming response, and the future direction of his show. He ignored them for now, still processing what had transpired, still considering the implications for his career, for his approach, for his legacy. On screen, Caroline's voice played back. "Young Americans aren't running from conservative values, they're running from the toxic ways both parties often express their values. They're looking for authenticity, for nuance." Hayes realized she had been right. Not just about political discourse, but about his show, about his entire approach. He had built a career on conflict, on reinforcing divisions rather than bridging them, on performances rather than conversations. And for the first time in years, he wondered if there might be another way, a better way, to engage with issues that mattered. A week later, the Hayes report aired again, but something was different. The opening graphics remained the same, the lighting, the set, the time slot unchanged. But Hayes himself appeared transformed, more subdued, more thoughtful. "Tonight, we're trying something different," he began, his voice missing its usual performative edge. "One guest, one conversation. No panels, no predetermined narratives, just an honest exchange about important issues." The camera pulled back, revealing a simplified set. 2 chairs facing each other directly, no imposing desk, no power positioning, just the visual language of actual dialogue. In the weeks and months that followed, the transformation continued. Ratings climbed steadily as the new format attracted viewers, tired of the usual partisan shouting. Other shows began to experiment with similar approaches, prioritizing substance over spectacle, understanding over victory. And across America, viewers responded, hungry for conversations that reflected the complexity of real issues, the humanity of different perspectives, the possibility of disagreeing without demonizing. Caroline Leavitt became a regular presence across media platforms, not because she had scored a viral victory, but because she had demonstrated a different way of engaging across deep political divides. She hadn't changed her conservative principles, but she had changed how she expressed them, how she engaged with those who disagreed, creating space for actual understanding even across the deepest divisions. The interview that had been designed to destroy her had instead revealed something powerful, that authenticity resonates, that substance matters, that treating viewers, audience members, and even political opponents with genuine respect might be not just the right approach, but the most effective one. And maybe, just maybe, a different kind of political conversation was possible after all.